Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
We are there to help students and serve them. It's our mission.
And education is transformational. It changes lives.
Hey everyone, my name is Colton Zadkovic and I'm a CU senior studying international affairs. And the upcoming panel focused on a discussion of what truly defines capitalism and socialism in today's age. We have assembled a group of panelists with a wide variety of backgrounds and expertise who will provide great insight into which economic and political systems around the world are working best and perhaps what isn't working as well here at home. I can't wait to hear more from our speakers about a topic that is especially of utmost interest to many college students across the country. Thanks for tuning in.
To our audience, welcome. Thank you for attending this CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel entitled, What Do Socialism and Capitalism Mean Today? This is certainly a provocative theoretical question. Both words are used so casually as to frequently defy interpretation. Socialism, in particular, has recently acquired so many meanings, particularly in the United States, that it no longer seems to have any meaning at all. The subtitle for this panel poses an additional question. Countries worldwide have a variety of economic and political systems, which are working well. This is a little more concrete and will give us all an opportunity to enjoy some factual as well as some conceptual interaction. Our panel consists of three individuals with vastly different and deeply interesting experiences. Alexander Verbeek has had a long career as a policy activist, advisor, and diplomat. He has been particularly involved in thinking about the global dangers that we face, from humanitarian risks through geopolitical and international security risks to his current concern with the accelerating environmental crisis. He is the policy director at the Environment and Development Resource Center in Brussels. Branko Milanovic has been a lead economist at the World Bank, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment, and has held several academic positions. Throughout his distinguished career, his work in the leading economic journals and in several published books has focused with distinctive insight on economic inequality. He is currently a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. Kathleen Ferrier has been involved in economic development at all levels, from grassroots development projects in Latin America to policy advisor to the Dutch government and international NGOs, to policy maker as a member of the Dutch Parliament. She now teaches languages and international relations and writes and speaks about international relations, female leadership, and diversity. She lives in Hong Kong, perhaps the one place in the world where the confrontation between some form of socialism and some form of capitalism is most explicit. I am our moderator. My name is Jeffrey Zaks. I'm a professor and an associate chair of the economics department here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Among my current research projects is a paper discussing the economic disadvantages of having a surname initial that is towards the end of the alphabet. That's why I've introduced the panelists in reverse alphabetical order. For the same reason, I'm going to ask them to make their initial presentations in the same order. As they do so, please remember that you are welcome to submit questions to me at any time through the YouTube chat. We particularly encourage questions from CU students and invite you to identify yourself and your current location, should you wish to. Alexander, would you please begin?
Thank you. It is wonderful to be back virtually at what is my favorite annual conference. And I'm afraid for today we have a definition problem. What is socialism? How do we solve in my 7 minutes that I have now as speaking time what socialism really is and what is capitalism? So as a starting point, I Googled socialism and then I clicked on images. And well, the page colored completely red. It was full with the kind of 1930s Russian propaganda posters with raised fists and lots of hammers and sickles. And then on a quite prominent place next to the portraits of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, I was surprised to find a picture of Joe Biden. And then I tried capitalism, dollar signs, lots of dollars everywhere on the page. Cartoons of people being trampled under the foot of capitalism. And there was a steam train on a graph running fastly downhill. And while through the steam and the emissions, you could just recognize our planet fading away. I've today no experience to share of living in self-proclaimed socialist or communist workers' paradises like the former Soviet Union, although I've visited it. But I've lived in countries like Germany and Austria, Sweden, and of course my home country, the Netherlands. And these are social democracies or variations within the Nordic model. Let's for now stay away from definitions and use the term Nordic model. There are elements of socialism within a capitalist framework, within a market economy. So these countries are well-functioning democracies. They have excellent education, healthcare for all. There's more equality. There's a well-functioning welfare system. In short, these are generally very pleasant, stable, and happy societies, although each of these countries, of course, has their challenges that they're working on. Now, recently, the Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin, suggested that the Nordic countries are better in achieving the American dream than the US. And she said literally, and I quote, every child, no matter their background or the background of their families, can become anything. And I suppose that for her as a woman of 35 and being the youngest prime minister in the world, she realized quite well that in most other countries in the world, there was no way that she could have become a prime minister. That is a position that is, for gray old men, unless they dye their hair. The World Economic Forum has made an index of social mobility. So that's the essence of the American dream, right? As Adams formulated that in the 1930s. In the top 10 of this social mobility list, you only find European countries. And then another institution, the UN, the United Nations, is backing the International Happiness Index that recently came out. It comes out every year. And you get roughly the same kind of countries that end up in the top 10. So this suggests there's a linkage between the Nordic model for a society and social mobility and happy people. So a lack of social mobility isn't only bad for the individual, it is bad for your society. We have economies that thrive on, human capital. We need the best people in the best positions, and we need everybody to be in a position where they have the best chance to achieve, because that is good for everybody. It's good for your society. Now, meanwhile, when we look at America, there has been an evolution of the American dream. In the 1930s, it was about equal socioeconomic opportunities. And also in the 1960s, when Dr. Martin Luther King spoke in his speech, I Have a Dream, he referred directly to the American dream. And he spoke especially of the disappearance of prejudice. So again, about equal chances. But if we look now in the more recent times, in the past few years, President Trump spoke about the American dream in several speeches, and he described it as getting rid of regulations. 75% was his target, because that is so good for business. But in the Nordic model, you don't want to get rid of regulations. You need the right regulations in place to create this more society. It's not a given. You don't get a more equal and more fair society by itself. So you need to give everybody equal chances, and you need to get that social mobility, and it will lead to more happiness. 50 years ago, in the 1970s, there were not only much less differences between the US and Europe, there were especially less differences in American society itself. A typical worker at General Motors earned in today's dollars $35 an hour. That is now down to 15. And what also went down in that period is the power of the unions. So who gained power? That is the big corporations. And with their wealth, they buy access into the democracy, which I believe was intended by the founding fathers for we the people. It never spoke about we, the CEOs. And now the richest 0.1% of Americans now have almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, 90, of the Americans put together. And when comparing a social democracy like in Europe to a more capitalist system in the US, the debate often goes in the direction that in Europe, big governments are regulating the markets with all kinds of rules, whereas the American market is more free, more fair, a market that works without interference, and that is the real market. But you have to realize that any market is constructed by rules. And so if big corporations want to control the market, they want to control those that organize the market. The big corporations want to control the politicians and the courts and the agencies that are in charge of those rules. So the big companies use their wealth to change the market. And through those change market rules, they earn more money, get more wealth, and start changing more the rules of the market. We're in that circle. So the wealth at the top is ever increasing. Wealth is trickling up instead of trickling down. And in the past year of the pandemic, we saw that the American billionaires got 44% richer than they were before the pandemic. And meanwhile, 80 million people in the US lost their jobs in the first year since the pandemic began. And only in last summer and autumn, 8 million Americans fell into poverty. So I'm now at the end of my 7 minutes limit. I just want to add one last thought that may be interesting for the debate. If we look in the future, in the decades to come, and the global challenges that we are facing, like climate change, I wonder if we need more socialism or more capitalism. In other words, is the liberal market economy that got us into this mess the best system to get us out of this mess? Well, thank you very much. I look forward to the debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexander. Branko, would you offer your thoughts?
Thank you very much. It's of course a pleasure to be there. I'm sure it is going to be a very interesting discussion. My job is easier because Alexander has actually very well laid out the issues. For starters, with a terminological issue that basically I think that when we define socialism, that it used to be defined and it should be defined is basically in terms of the property or ownership of the means of production and the centralized coordination. We don't have socialist model anymore. So I think that particular term has now acquired a different meaning. As I'm the author of the Capitalism Alone book, obviously I'm going to claim that there is only one system in the world, economic system in the world today, and that's capitalism. Now, Alexander has focused on the distinction between social democratic capitalism in basically all of Europe and more neoliberal capitalism in the United States. But I think we should also look at the world. And there, of course, we have capitalism with a much greater role of the state, in particular China or Vietnam. So we have really varieties of capitalist experience. However, if you compare today's situation with the situation in the 1970s, it is very clear that the world has actually converged to a system, or to the systems rather, that are more similar. I mean, just to remind people, or maybe young people who were not even born then, we had really a great variety of systems in the 1970s, from the state centralized system of the Soviet Union to labor management in Yugoslavia, to import substitution systems in Turkey or Brazil, to social democracy in Europe, to again more liberal capitalism in the United States, and to Hong Kong. So, you know, really, you had really basically like 6 or 7 systems to choose from. Nowadays, you don't. It is actually much more limited. And in that sense, capitalism has won. A second point I would like to mention is one thing that we should not forget also when we talk about individual countries, they're sort of situated within the world. Now, the world is a very unequal place. And whereas actually Alexander was rightly emphasizing the success of the social democratic countries, it is also true that many of them have very high inequality and wealth. And many of them, like Sweden in particular, have had a significant increase in inequality in the last 30 years. So that system itself has been undergoing a change. It is still different from the American system, but it's actually not as different as I think sometimes we like to claim. It is true, actually, as Alexander said, of course, that the intergenerational mobility is much greater in European countries than in Nordic countries, actually. I'm not, in that sense, I think Europe is not the right way to generalize, because actually in many countries like Italy, actually, intergenerational mobility is low. But generally in Nordic countries, it is higher intergenerational mobility than the US. And then when we talk about this global aspect, one has to also realize that about between 50 to 60% of our own income is determined by the place where we live. So in other words, the large differences in the world which exist are very much reflected in our individual incomes. And that, of course, means that people who are born in poor countries are basically condemned to poverty unless they live in a country like Asian countries like Vietnam or China or Indonesia or Thailand that have had actually very successful period of the last 40 years. So that international aspect, I think, is actually quite important, because it also underlies the demand for migration. And my last point is simply to distinguish, maybe it is not terminological, it's I think fundamental one, to distinguish between the economic sphere, where we talk about capitalism, or we might even want to talk about socialism, depending how we define it, from the political sphere, where we have different systems, and where sometimes we sort of assume that liberal capitalism has to go with democracy, but I think that empirically is not true. Actually, if you look at, for example, take Polity4 database and then calculate what percentage of time and countries to go with Chile or Turkey or Greece or Congo or Spain, or actually most of European countries between the two world wars were not democracies, and of course they were capitalist countries. So, these two things really are not necessarily going together, and we don't see them together today, obviously with examples of Russia or even Turkey or China or others that are capitalist countries, but they are not particularly democratic. So that would be sort of my take for the beginning.
Thank you, Branko. Kathleen, would you offer us your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this prestigious Boulder Conference on World Affairs. I have to say to you that I'm not based in Hong Kong. I moved to the Netherlands, so I'm based in the Netherlands now. I lived in Hong Kong for a long time. And today we talk about socialism and capitalism and what they mean today. And I want to share with you just some of my personal experiences and thoughts. And I want to challenge you, and Branko already challenged you in the same way, and that is by adding another concept here, which is the political sphere, and which is in this case the concept of democracy. When we talk about socialism and capitalism, we talk about economic systems, but of course also about political systems. Now, I've lived in Chile under dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, and I've lived until recently in Hong Kong, where I witnessed indeed the umbrella movement and all the other things happening that made us see how democratic values were and still are gradually torn down by an authoritarian system that is called by the president Xi Jinping socialism with Chinese characteristics. And the interesting thing, according to my view, is that this kind of socialism is related, or better say, can only exist because of its capitalist economy. And it's very successful. The whole system, we have to recognize, is successful. Nowhere else in the world so many people were taken out of poverty in such a short time as in authoritarian, state-controlled, and capitalistic China. Nowhere in the world can measures, for instance, when it comes to tackling climate change, be put in practice as quickly and as efficiently as in China. But the question is, at what price? The absence of democratic values, the absence of freedom of expression, the lack of transparency, the lack of independence in the juridical system, what is it worth? Now, the interesting question that I have, and I would like to hear your comments, is that the way we in the USA and in the northwestern part of Europe experience our democracies and our democratic freedoms is under threat because our democratic systems are under threat. We take them for granted, but when you have a look at our geopolitically fastly changing world, I tell you, these freedoms cannot be taken for granted anymore. Any person in China, or perhaps even in Russia, would ask you what your democracy is worth if it can lead to chaos around the borders when it comes to dealing and treating in a humane way with refugees, or when it can lead to electing people like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil or Donald Trump in the United States. So I would say that if we ask ourselves what socialism and capitalism can mean today, we have to ask ourselves also about the values these systems stand for, and also what the core values are of our democratic systems as we relate them to capitalist systems or to socialist systems, whether this is with or without Chinese characteristics. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. And thanks to all our panelists for offering such insightful, provocative, and concise introductions. I now offer the panelists the opportunity to address each other if they have comments they want to share. And when that concludes, I'll have some questions to offer them from my own perspective. But for the moment, Branko, Alexander, Kathleen, do you want to have a conversation among yourselves?
Thank you. Oh, if I may ask something, Jeffrey,
Yes.
Something that Alexander said and that Branko actually elaborated on, and that really that I really find very interesting to explore more, is the effect of regulations. And as Alexander was saying, we need regulations. Thanks to regulations, we have social mobility, we have happiness, and etc. But in the meantime, in spite of having these regulations, we could not prevent that that there is such a huge imbalance between the number of people who are the richest ones in the world and the huge number of people who are the have-nots, just to use that old word again. So wanting to regulate this, doesn't this automatically directs us to more state-controlled, more authoritarian, less free societies? That's my question. Is it clear?
Alexander, do you want to respond? Alexander, you're muted.
There we go. That always happens to somebody, and often it's me that I start talking when it's muted. No, I'm very much with Kathleen on the thinking. I mean, if we look in the future of this century, let's say the next decades to come, we have some enormous challenges to face. On one hand, there's, let's say, the planetary challenges. There's climate change. There's biodiversity loss. It is really, really urgent. We need to take action now. And we can only do that if all countries in the world work together. And if we recognize that the countries that have created this mess, that have for 200 years, and especially since Second World War, been burning so much fossil fuels, that they are the ones relatively less impact, and that the countries, take a country in the Sahel in Africa, for instance, that contributed next to zero to the problem, is hurt so much by the problem that we have caused. So that is one problem. The other one is increasingly in the last few years, you get the feeling that you get a kind of clash between different cultures, different ideas of how to govern. Let's say the Western model and the China model, to put it simply. So we can only solve the first problem by all of us working together. It is no use if just one country becomes really, really green and the rest doesn't go there. You have to work together, but you're also in a kind of competition. So there's this competition between different systems, and you to get out of this, you will need to work together. You need regulation, and you need more fairness, and in a sense, you need more equality, which is a logical. Is my last thought here. It's a logical consequence by getting a smaller planet. You know, we're so much more connected. So in the old days, in the Wild West, it was easy without any rules to walk around with your horse and your gun because there was hardly anybody there. But now that we all live in cities and we're connected and a pandemic can hurt everybody at once all over the world, you have to work together and you have to set the rules of the game. Thanks.
Branko, please.
Yes, I think it's a really quite a fascinating conversation. It does so happen that I think I agree with 90% of what Alexander has said and what Kathleen has said. But it would be boring to focus on the 90%, so let me focus on the 10%. So I would like to challenge a little bit. In the case of Alexander, I would really challenge this slightly, in my opinion, embellished presentation of the Nordic model. Not only because of inequality that I mentioned before only, which has been increasing, but for example, problems with immigration. We know that, for example, Denmark has one of the most draconian anti-immigration law. Countries are really not able anymore to accept migrants for many reasons. I will not go into that, whether economic, cultural, social, or whatever. So this is an issue. There has been also an issue between Northern and Southern Europe when it comes to the Greek crisis and more recently to the bonds with Italy and so on. So we have lots of words about how should I say, solidarity. But when really the situation hits, when it's a crisis situation, like with pandemic now in Europe, that solidarity somehow disappears. Although we, as I said, we talk a lot about that. Second, I found Kathleen's presentation really quite inspirational and excellent. I would like simply to say one thing that actually seems to me that capitalism as a system requires that we place really the acquisition of wealth at the top of our priorities. That consequently demotes the role of democracy that we as individuals need. And then there is a certain clash there. And I think she has really extremely well pointed out to that clash that we see actually authoritarian systems economically, particularly China, doing so well. And many people in more democratic system would say, like, really, if I want to have this road built here or this airport built or water supplied, why do I care about democracy if I need to drink clean water? And I think this is really an issue that we have to face.
Let me ask a question about that. The authoritarian instinct is historically always with us. Has the economic expression of that changed? That is, do authoritarians in the contemporary world, have they discovered a different way to organize their economy so as to sustain their authoritarian instincts than authoritarians 20 or 30 or 50 years ago might have chosen? Alexander, please.
Well, I think the main thing that has changed is that when I grew up, it used to be that, democracies in the world were also the most successful economies. And now in the past 20 years or so, that is no longer true. For if you look at economic growth, although a caveat here, starting at a lower level, economic growth is faster, more successful in authoritarian regimes. And that is the new kid on the block. And if you look in long stretches of history, looking back, the winners in the world are the ones that have the strongest economy. It is not your strongest army, which is a temporary thing, but in the long term, it is who has the strongest economy is winning. And that is a kind of new challenge for those that believe in well-functioning democracies, that we don't have the best economic system anymore. Of course, as I said before, I'm talking here now, let's say, about China and other countries in let's say, Southeast Asia that lifted so many people out of poverty. But that's, of course, a different situation than if you start at a higher level. One note back on migration. Yes, that is a challenge, unfortunately, because at this moment we have, let's say, 500 million people in Europe and 1 million that want to come in. And I personally am not convinced of that problem, although I read in the newspaper that for many people it's a problem. If I give a party and I invite 500 people, and then one extra person comes in and knocks on the door, says, "Can I join the party?" I would say, "My door is open, you can join." But with what's going to happen in the world, that in the next decades, huge parts of Northern Africa and the Middle East will several months a year become so hot that healthy people like you and me cannot survive. What is going to happen? That pressure might become much, much more bigger. It's not a given, by the way, that they all go to Europe. They might go to nearby cities or something else. But I expect that the conflicts will rise, people will migrate more, and we get more of that pressure. And yes, that is definitely that is going to test the system. It's going to test our solidarity, and it's going to test our norms and values, how we treat other people. And that last aspect is already tested very much every day now in the Mediterranean. Thanks.
Kathleen, please.
Yes, if I may elaborate a little bit on this. I think Branko brought in a very interesting issue, and that is what Alexander was talking about also, and that is the concept of solidarity, related to the fact that, as Alexander was saying, we can only solve the challenges we are facing as human beings on this planet if we really work together. If we were not aware about this because of the situation of climate, the severeness of this situation, those who were not aware of that, now we have the pandemic. That shows us that, this hits us all regardless of any differences in gender or ethnicity or whatever. We see the differences in how badly people are hit by the pandemic based on differences we as human beings have created. Just to say that those who live in the poorer parts of the world have less access to healthcare, if there is any healthcare. And now we also see, when it comes to the vaccines, you say, the vaccines, people in Europe want to keep it all for themselves. So on the one hand, as Branko was saying, we have these challenges we can only face in solidarity. Also, when it comes to migration, I want to add to what Alexander has said, is that perhaps in your party of 500 people, where one is dropping in, perhaps you need more people for your party because you expect 500, but then a lot of them are gray and old and they don't want to dance anymore. So there you are with 30 people and you want a party of 500. So you're happy that migrants are coming in. This is just to say that we are heading to a time when we need migrants, at least in Europe. So the awareness that we need each other to solve problems. And in the meantime, it's my country first. It's America first, it is Europe first, it is the Netherlands first, it is Russia first, it is China first, it is Brazil first. And we are not going to go any further with this. So how do you relate solidarity, which is so badly needed, to capitalist systems and socialist systems?
We're getting a fair amount of interest in the conversation, the elements of the conversation that touched on China. Let's try to address that a little more thoroughly. So if we think about the Chinese cultural sphere, we have Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, all countries that are culturally from the Chinese environment, all countries that are much wealthier than China itself, even though they all began, relatively speaking, 50, 80 years ago at equally poor levels. So if Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan have done so much better than China itself, how miraculous is the Chinese experience? And how much does the Chinese experience really have to teach us about what successful economies are?
Well,
yeah, okay.
Alexander.
Yeah, I think Kathleen is the expert in this field, but two major differences is, of course, the scale. Singapore and Hong Kong are city-states, or Hong Kong's not a state, but there are cities, and China is huge. And the other big difference is, of course, that China started much more later. They first had tried out all kinds of different systems like Cultural Revolution, etc. That were not at all successful. So it's only with Deng Xiaoping, and then we are, I think, in 1978, but I'm not at all a China expert. Then 78 that they started to change the system. By that time, Singapore and Hong Kong were already at a completely different level of development. And the last aspect is, of course, that China is so huge that it's it's developing in phases. Let's say the east and the coastlines develop much more faster than more the inland. So there's a constant influx of coming in from the west. But Kathleen is the expert here. I'm no China expert at all.
I'm very, very interested in hearing what Branko has to say about this, because he has very interesting theories also on corruption in China and how corruption is used even. I'm very curious to hear Branko's ideas. But it is true what you are saying, Alexander. There is a different pace of development, and what I find very interesting is to see how, in spite of differences, when you look at economic welfare in the region, the influence of China is huge and it is everywhere. What happens in Myanmar and what happened in Myanmar and what is happening, the tragic, deeply tragic events in Myanmar is only possible because China allows it to happen. And now, when it comes to Myanmar, it's interesting to see what will happen, because the developments have not been as they were expected, and this is affecting Chinese business. So we have to see what will happen. But what we see in Hong Kong, what we see happening inside of China in Xinjiang, China, Beijing does whatever it wants and it's never stopped. And so my theory is that the influence of China in the whole region, but not only in the region, in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, and I assume also in North America, the influence of China, of Chinese economy, but also political way of thinking is huge and is much bigger than we think and that we are aware of. It's called sharp power. You know, China does not use the tactics Russia uses by trying to poison the opposition leader. China will not do it. You know, with all the events in 2019, people kept asking me, what will happen? Beijing will not let this happen in Hong Kong. All these protests, all these millions of people getting out to the street, what will happen? Will they send in their militaries? Will we see Tiananmen Square again? The square of the heavenly peace, what we saw in 1989 in Beijing. Will that happen in Hong Kong? I said it will not happen. China has other measures, other ways, other tactics. And that's what happened. Now we have the security law, and that is like a coup d'etat. Hong Kong does not exist anymore. The Hong Kong we knew under the system, under the principle of one country, two systems. So don't underestimate the influence of China, the economic, but also the political influence. But I'm very curious to hear Branko on this issue.
Okay, well, that's very kind of you, Kathleen. I actually, well, I have to say that my background, I was always interested in Chinese communist history. So I knew that history quite well. And then I lost somewhat interest when China sort of became capitalist country. But then recently, maybe 6-7 years ago, I regained it. And so I've been quite interested, obviously, more recently, personally. I have to say, to go back to the question that was actually posed to us, it is a very clever question, but it's a little bit biased. First, as Alexander said, because of the scale, you know, obviously Hong Kong and Singapore cannot be really, we can put Macau then as well. You know, we can, this is not a comparison with China. Secondly, one should, on two issues there, one should not forget that the entire Chinese development until early 80s, when China eventually made a compromise solution with the United States, was done despite and with strong opposition of the United States. The United States was actually preventing China of doing anything. And on the contrary, was opening its markets and making everything possible for South Korea, for Taiwan, and for Japan, obviously, for Asian countries. So that was a point that was, I think, very well made by Arrighi. You know, the developments in Asia cannot be dissociated with the geopolitical context which was after World War II. Now, the major change, of course, happened with China becoming de facto ally of the United States against the Soviet Union after 1980. So that opened the Chinese world, and that opened China, and then we have actually now living with the results of that. But that was yet again, very nice book, actually, I have to say, by Kissinger on China. Really beautiful book, and that geopolitical aspect was absolutely crucial. So that's one point. Now, secondly, I would like to say about Taiwan that in my sort of belief is that Kuomintang would not have done the reforms in China had it won the war that it did in Taiwan, because it realized that it lost the war because it didn't want to do land reform. It didn't want to actually make education equally accessible to everybody. It kept really a very narrow elite at the top. And then it learned a lesson. And of course, Taiwan is a big success case, not only economically, but we have seen it recently with the pandemic. So it has to be, of course, acknowledged. And the final point about international relations, I actually see Chinese influence, which I believe, as Kathleen said, is really quite important, but I see it in a more favorable light as sort of a beginning, hopefully, of a bipolar world where the power of a single country would be limited by simply countervailing force. It's the same thing that we have within national assistance. We have countervailing forces. I think globally, a world ruled by one state would not be a particularly good world. So we don't have really great choice, but I think having two hegemons is better than having one.
Thanks to all of you for this fascinating conversation. It's time to address some of the questions that are being raised by the audience. But Branko, before we do that, many of these questions do have referred to capitalism and its virtues and its challenges. Could you perhaps, if your position is that capitalism is essentially the dominant or only system currently present, could you give us a quick synopsis of what the common elements are in capitalism across the world? We have so many countries with superficially different systems. What do you see as the essential elements that define the capitalism that now dominates us?
Well, I will be very brief because I don't want to take too much time, but I really think that the essential features are very nicely summarized, and it goes back to Marx's definition of capitalism, Max Weber, and all that. And there are really three of them. That most of the production is conducted on privately owned means of production. And that's the case in China, that actually 80% of the value added is produced by the private sector. Secondly, that the labor does not have a management role. The management role is generally associated with ownership of capital or hired managers who are hired by capitalists. So that, of course, rules out situations like co-determination or labor management, because simply laborers are simply hired for labor. And the third point is decentralized coordination. And that's why I think actually China, if you look at each of these individual points, really fulfills them. So these would be, in my opinion, the common features of capitalism. And last caveat, obviously, the role of the state in China and the control of certain parts of the economy, sectors like the banking, finance, electricity, IT, and all of that is, of course, different than in other countries. So there is no doubt that one has to acknowledge that. But I think the three essential features are similar in China, or you take Mali or Egypt or Brazil, they're all there.
Thank you, Branko. That's very clarifying, and I hope that will help us impose some order on the remainder of the conversation. So, for example, here's a question from a member of the audience. China claims to have an economic system called socialism with Chinese characteristics. Is their system socialism at all? Or is it a hybrid of socialism and capitalism? Or is it something else entirely?
Shall I try to answer that one?
Please.
It is socialist in the sense that it is socialist, if you explain socialism as state-controlled, it is a totally state-controlled system where the state defines what you can hear, what you can read, what you can believe, what is allowed, what is not allowed. But when it comes to the economic system, it is capitalistic in the sense that was said here earlier, a system that can make possible the acquisition of wealth. So that was allowed during Deng Xiaoping, but and so the system started to change, and everybody, or not everybody, a lot of people expected China to become a more democratic system, a more open system. But what we see absolutely since President Xi Jinping took power in 2012 is that he wants to move back again to, let us say, the old traditional communist ideas. And that is why he calls his way of being an authoritarian leader is socialism with Chinese characteristics, and socialism as explained in a totalitarian state where human rights are not respected in the way that we in other parts of the world might look at human rights, where the juridical system is not transparent, is not independent, where there's no freedom of speech. And so in that sense, it is communist, socialist, and the Chinese character is that the Chinese culture moving back to the times of Mao, using the Chinese cultural values, and there the word values again, of Confucianism, of obedience, of longing for harmony, which is a very important concept in Chinese culture, is used to control this state of unfreedom and state-controlled system. I hope that this more or less answers the question.
Here's another question from Michael Dew. Does the conflict between the profit motive and our collective best interest, ecological, economic efficiency, humanitarian, necessitate the eventual dismantling of capitalistic economies and systems? So I guess, Branko, this is to some degree directed to you. We may all be capitalists now, but are we going to have to stay capitalist? And if not, how are we going to change that?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I think there is this contradiction. I mentioned it also before, actually. There is this contradiction, and the contradiction really carries over to many aspects. Actually, Kathleen mentioned it also, and Alexander as well. If you take the climate change is really fundamentally is individuals' contributions to the emissions. And we know that actually 10% of the people in the world are responsible for something about 60% or maybe more actually of the emissions. So this is really something that has to do with individual income and behavior. But we have no means of doing that at that level. So we are doing it by country level. So we do have already the problem that we have an issue that is really fundamental individual issue, but we don't have the tools of dealing with that because our tools in a system which we have, which is an international system, really international with a system between the countries, cannot deal with it. In other words, we really speak all the time like how much is emissions of China, how much is of India, how much of the United States, without acknowledging sufficiently that on a per capita basis it's very different, and particularly within a country it's very different depending on your level of income. So I think that there are all of these contradictions, and we mentioned before, I think Kathleen mentioned the issue of vaccines. They are all present there. And of course, to answer your question, the question in the audience, I don't know, obviously, there is a conflict between these two elements or two values, but whether we would actually have to jettison capitalism for that, I'm not quite convinced about this.
Any other thoughts about that question? Then let's try another from David Heinrich. Do you think that the authoritarian regimes that push their economies so quickly, such as China, will eventually run out of ways to control the markets and further their growth potentials? I'm thinking about how much economic growth was attained by the USSR in the Cold War, but then we all saw how that entire system collapsed. So is there a ceiling? Is there a ceiling for places like China? For example, let me help a little bit here. China scores relatively high on corruption indices and relatively low on indices of respect for private property. Is there a ceiling on what an economy can accomplish with those levels, with Chinese levels of corruption and with Chinese levels of disrespect for private ownership? Alexander.
Well, I've no idea whether there's a ceiling or not. I cannot answer that question. But the point of corruption is an interesting one. Well, maybe not corruption, but what I'm thinking of when the pandemic started. Rumor has it that interesting people, important people, were not passing on the information quickly enough to Beijing to warn that there were troubles there. If you would have had a more open society, if the bureaucrats would not have acted, then the people would have spoken out, and news of the problem would earlier have been known everywhere, and then the state, whether it's a democratic one or less democratic one, could earlier have taken action. So if there are these kind of flaws in the system, that may cause more trouble in the future, especially when, it's one thing to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which is an amazing feat that China did. But if you get more on, let's say, a Western kind of level of economy, the demands of the population might also be different, and that's something that where Branko referred to in his opening speech. If there are first needs that you want to have, like food and water and shelter, but at a certain moment, once you have those, your level of happiness as a family becomes less dependent on those material things, but you are asking for, more things like freedom and expression. At least that's how we have seen it in the West. And I wonder how that will develop in China.
I think Branko knows much more about it, but I have to say that I do not agree with you. People often think that when China opens up, when Chinese families can send their children to universities like in Boulder or in Canada or in Europe, these young people will come back with ideas of freedom of expression, and they will want to change the Chinese society. As far as I have seen it, it's not happening. They come back and they go back to the Chinese system they are used to. But I know that Branko has very interesting ideas on corruption with Chinese characteristics.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this Chinese characteristics, because one of the issues that I have with my book, it's called Capitalism Alone, and actually spends quite a lot of time on China. It was published in Taiwan in Chinese. But it doesn't stand much of a chance of being published in China, despite the fact that actually in the original part, in the first part of the chapter on China, I think it's basically very much supportive of the revolution and of the role of the Communist Party of China. But then, of course, claims what I said before, that China is a capitalist country, which, of course, I had some discussions that they would like to change this in the terminological into socialism with the Chinese characteristics. But to go back to your original question, yes, I actually argue that corruption is a systemic feature of the system of what they call political capitalism, because that system cannot really have the rule of law, because the rule of law means that there is no bureaucratic discretion. If you have a system which needs bureaucratic discretion so that you can punish somebody for some transgression and you can actually give favor to somebody else, you cannot have a rule of law. And the conflict between these two leads to a sort of existence of corruption, which becomes really an intrinsic part of the system. So I really see corruption as being really intrinsic to the system of political capitalism. But that also makes me understand Xi Jinping's approach to corruption. Because if you have such a system and you do nothing, then that system, I call it like a swamp. This is like a river. Corruption really spreads. And then you have really a flood. And then the system is over. So what you have to do every 20 years, you have to have an anti-corruption campaign to push people a little bit back into the river bed and then sort of let the system go. So I actually think that intrinsically it is in the system itself, and it cannot be seen as an anomaly, as some people believe. So that was, if that's what you had in mind, that was my view. And of course, there are really now interesting, there is an interesting book by Yang Ang, for example, arguing that in some instances, Chinese corruption is actually growth enhancing. It's an interesting book and an interesting approach.
Ranko, thank you very much for concluding our conversation so eloquently. Alexander, Kathleen, thank you for your participation. Sadly, it must come to an end because it is now the designated time to terminate the panel. Thank you again very much for your contributions. And to the audience, thank you for joining us today. And a special thank you to our speakers who have volunteered their time to be with us. If you would like to support them and learn more about their work, you can find their books, podcasts, and social media accounts linked on the CWA website. The CWA relies on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. Please consider making a gift to the CWA, which can also be done on the CWA website, which is www.colorado.edu/CWA. Tune in through Sunday, April 11th for live CWA events, or catch up on those you missed on the CWA YouTube channel. Thank you again for joining us.